Okay, good afternoon, everybody. Good afternoon. I hope you've all had a tremendously enriching afternoon in the various parts of Tallinn today that you've all been to, and I hope we'll have an enriching panel session here to talk about NATO. The title is, so I should introduce myself first. I'm Anton Guardia from The Economist. I'm based in Brussels now. Before that, I used to spend some time worrying about NATO, going to Afghanistan and places like that as a defense correspondent. But I retain an interest. And so these days I cover the other institution in Brussels, which is not NATO, and the distance is rather far apart. It's only a few miles, but it's actually a different world away. Anyhow, I think the title says something about NATO, defining itself, brackets, again, close brackets. We do that at The Economist, lots of brackets. And it sort of speaks to a certain insecurity about NATO, that it feels the need to define itself. And I think the second part of the title also says something. NATO after Chicago, Libya and Afghanistan. Before the Cold War, NATO did nothing but never felt the need to define itself, nor did it worry about its existence. After the Cold War, it worried endlessly about defining itself and felt it only remained relevant for as long as it was doing things. So now that Afghanistan is winding down, that Libya has happened, that Chicago is about to go on, what should the leaders be talking about in Chicago? What will they talk about and what should they talk about, which may not necessarily be the same thing. We have an excellent panel today. We have Benoît who is, let me get the title correct, he is a member of the Foreign Affairs Council of the French Foreign Ministry. We have Tomas Valasek from the Center for European Reform. We have Ambassador Jüri Luik, the permanent representative of Estonia to NATO, and we have Damon, Executive Director of the Atlantic Council. And I'm just going to start from left to right to make it easy. And I think one of the really interesting things about Chicago, that this is one of the early coming out parties for François Hollande, the new French president. One of the great exciting things that happened in my time as defense correspondent in NATO was the arrival of France in the integrated military command. How do you think that has gone? How has that experience gone for France? How's it gone for NATO? And will Hollande keep it up?
Well, first, thank you for putting me on the left. It's a new situation for me. Well, there's nothing wrong about NATO adapting itself again, still or forever to new circumstances. I think there's two factors which are obvious. First, expeditionary fatigue. Afghanistan, of course, the public opinion, but also the fact that Libya was a rather mediocre toolbox, at least at the start. And, of course, the economic crisis. I think the capacity initiative, smart defense, will be a bit like aspirin, which is temporary relief for local pain with less side effect as possible. Now, I think that Chicago, at least from a French point of view, will run smoothly, but will not be a milestones in the evolution of alliance. There's four reasons. The first one is that the Europeans don't want to embarrass Obama, and I think even the Russians have no interest, because especially the Russians want to have a ISAF withdrawal, which is not disturbing, because they have an interest in Central Asia, they have their relationship with India, so they don't want, in fact, they want us to do that very well. The second factor is the traditional spoilers, which are Turkey, especially about the Iranian missile capacity, and French about the nuclear aspect of the doctrine of NATO. I don't think the problem has been largely solved. And Hollande has taken a very strong stand on saying, I will not go back to on the Sarkozy decision of full participation. I put the nuclear standing group apart. Second, I don't think that the expenditure constraint which on our budget will affect in a big way the French defense capacity. First, because most of the investment on the nuclear aspect have been done in the recent year, and there is no much decision needed before the end of Hollande presidential term. Second, because on the projection forces, there's been a lot of investment done for Afghanistan, and Libya have proven, putting aside the tank refueling plane, that we had a rather consistent capacity. Also, there is a big consensus in France that the defense expenditure are a element in the preservation of a technological and industrial basis. So I don't think that there will be cuts, but those cuts will not be as deep as the Brits, and they will not affect too much the capacity. At least it's the current thing. Second, Afghanistan, Hollande has been saying that he will seize the combat role, which is already the case in Surubi. And in fact, there's a lot of allied which have been doing non-combating role, but training. And we have been training the Afghan forces since 10 years, especially the officer corps, and we will continue. The problem is whether it is a contribution in kind or a contribution in a monetary aspect, in a trust fund. We have already said that when we were asked to pay for 100 million or 200 million, that was out of the question, and but we will trade. The other aspect of Hollande, which is quite important, is the fact that he will continue to be quite strong on defense, because and we have seen during the campaign that he was not willing really to make it an electoral issue, and he has really obliged some of the left part of his party to go along, especially on the military nuclear. Now, the issue of the nuclear role, the American stationing in Europe, which was a big preoccupation for us in the posture, the nuclear posture in Lisbon, has been put aside, and we are not shedding a tear about the end of the study on deterrence. The issue of the Asian shift of the US shift to Asia will not be really prominent, because the US have given reassurance.
We'll come back to that.
Yeah, no,
later.
but I think so. For us, it's looked like now as a smooth summit. But there are issues which will not be solved and which still will be very difficult. The first one is the financial issue. In Lisbon, we reached an agreement on improving the financial governance of the alliance, which was absolutely dismal and indecent. Now it's going better. But there is still the issue of the common financing, strongly pushed by the Secretary General, and which is a potential minefield, because we see it as their responsibility for the nation. We see that as an inducement to a variable speed alliance, and we see that as a way to discourage a nation to continue to invest on defense. The second is the alliance structure. Headquarters are a bit more deployable. We have reduced the number, the PE, but still there is a lot to do. And we have created the idea of two big agencies for supporting especially communication. And really nobody knows how they will be controlled, how they will be financed, they will be customer-based, and it will introduce a big change in the way the alliance is working. Now, there is still a lot of unknown on that side of the reform, and we see that there is not much interest in the Secretary General to pursue the internal reform, even if he considers that he is the chief executive. But we have been a bit disappointed. Now, the issue is always the same, the dilemma of NATO. Either it is you focus on the military core function of the alliance, doing at minimum a kind of toolbox, or you consider that the main feature of the alliance is to represent a kind of the West facing new emerging power on the international scene. Everybody can choose. For the French, it's obviously the first solution.
Right, so strong on defense, remaining in NATO, and strong on internal reform. Tomas, there's a lot of talk of smart defense. Is it, as Kurt Volker puts it, where is he, dumb defense with less money?
I like Benoît's analogy better of smart defense as aspirin. I think that's just about right. It's not something that is going to cure your fever, but it sure as hell will help with your headache. And because of that, I'd rather have it and get it right than not have it at all. And then the reason we need it is because it's not a sufficient answer. I think Kurt is right to be skeptical. But it's the only answer we have in the current conditions of the financial crisis to the other big change in NATO, and that's pivot, whatever you will call it, the change in the U.S. strategic priorities away from Europe towards Asia. Now, Damon will talk about it a little more. I'm not going to steal his thunder, but I don't think he would disagree with me if I argued that the practical military implication of the pivots are potentially pretty dramatic. I think that what pivot means, if you break it down for future operations, it means that the United States is essentially telling us that it will behave more like any other ally, that in the future it will sit out some missions potentially, it will lead some wars, but it may just as often, possibly more often, simply do just enough to help other countries succeed in operations. It will, in other words, be like us, not the country that it used to be before. Its armed forces will no longer make up the difference between European ambitions and its military means, and that's potentially a game-changing difference. In practice, it means that some future crises may simply go unanswered because no country will want to take a lead. Even in those crises where the Europeans do take a lead, without some of the American enablers, these will be very different wars. And the thing to be pointed out, and needs to be pointed out, we had that conversation with Kurt earlier, there are some things that only the United States has and possesses in the alliance. Things like proper massive capacity to destroy enemy air defenses, real proper encrypted communication capacity, targeting and precision on a mass scale, really truly only possessed by the United States. We Europeans will still be able and will need to fight more wars without U.S. leadership and possibly without U.S. participation as its priorities move towards Asia. But the wars fought the, for lack of a better term, European way of war will be different. They'll be less high-tech. They'll be less sophisticated, because of that potentially more bloody, involving more civilian casualties, unintended civilian casualties. They may well last longer, and they may well cost more in Allied lives. I'm being told by French defense planners, Benoît may correct me and disagree with me, I'm told by French defense planners that Libya lasted several weeks longer than it could have and should have, because the United States withdrew the fixed-wing close attack, close support aircraft, the A-10s. We eventually replaced them by essentially with French helicopters, but to bring French helicopters closer to Libya, to bring the ships that bore the French helicopters closer to Libya, we first essentially had to sink Libyan Navy and then preposition French ships so that the helicopters can provide the sort of things that was in place and was then taken away in the form of the A-10s. A couple of weeks lost, millions, if not tens of millions of dollars damage to the future Libyan Navy's capacity to defend itself, and immeasurable lives lost as well. That's not a criticism of the United States. Europe should be able to do these things by itself. We're adults, we're rich. But the reality is, when we fight wars in the future without the Americans, they'll be fought differently. They may be bloody, they will take longer, and because of it, I suspect we'll be somewhat more reluctant to enter into wars. I mean, it's already bloody difficult to make the case for these discretionary wars in many European capitals. And that's difficult under current circumstances, where we have established a pretty high threshold of nearly 0 civilian casualties in Libya, and a fairly high of 0 casualties in Kosovo and Libya on the Allied side. These are very sophisticated wars we fight. The public has gotten used to them. And if we as Europeans can't guarantee the same level of sophistication, the same level of ease or apparent ease, I suspect the future leaders will be more reluctant to go to war. So we do. This is one of the practical implications of the U.S. pivot. We will be less capable. The best answer that we can find under the current circumstances of an economic crisis is smart defense. My last point on this, Anton. I appreciate smart defense is insufficient. Ideally, we should be increasing our defense budgets and buying the sort of things that the United States used to provide and may not always provide in the future. The reality is we won't, as long as the crisis is what it is. Under the circumstances, the best we can do is make better use of the existing assets. I don't think we have gotten enough out of smart defense yet. I think what NATO has done in terms of creating these projects under ACT has been both good and sufficient, but hasn't gone nearly far enough. I don't think the alliance has gotten far enough into the heads of the defense ministers. Jüri, you are one. You will know you will know better than anybody in the room, possibly, with the exception of your colleagues, what political minefield collaboration, multinational defense collaboration is. I mean,
let's go on to that.
If you want me to, yes, I can. Very briefly. I mean,
I was going to bring Jüri in, but so.
Sure. Do you want to bring Jüri in?
Do you want to hold that? I
want to hear from Jüri, but
hold that thought.
Indeed.
Jüri, I mean, it's a sort of grim picture in terms of capability that Tomas paints. Is this a sort of alliance that you still feel comfortable in being? Is it sort of alliance that you think ensures your security? And I guess thirdly, do you feel that the emphasis on expeditionary capability is at the detriment of Article 5 contingencies?
Thank you, and thank you for these questions, all very, very pertinent questions. Let me start by saying that, of course, for Estonia, this is the only option. I mean, look at where we are situated, look at what our own capabilities are. The alliance is our only option. That's why it's also our best option. And obviously, we will make whatever efforts are needed to make alliance work today and also in the future. Let me grasp some of the themes which have already been touched upon. Since I'm sitting at the moment around the NATO table, kind of reflect on them, as Secretary General of NATO likes to say. Also, I emphasize that I'm speaking on my personal capacity and not as a representative of the government. On smart defense. Defense spending is, of course, a major problem. As Bob Gates said, during the Cold War, the United States spent 50% of NATO's budget, or paid for 50% of NATO's budget. Now the Americans are paying for 75% of NATO's budget. So it's evident to everybody that it is going up. And the gaps are, of course, in various categories. They are in so-called high-end capabilities, which means capabilities for possibly territorial war, land war. They are also in high-tech capabilities, the capabilities which are necessary for clean, quick wars, which clearly everybody likes. And Libya is a good example of that. I very much agree that the Libyan war could have been run only by European capabilities. But the key issue for the Libyan war was that there shouldn't be civilian casualties. Otherwise, the whole political point of protecting civilians would have been lost. So the surgical strike capabilities, which the Americans had, obviously is a crucial matter. Europeans can fight, but they can fight messily. They can fight with civilian casualties on their own side, which basically means they don't want to fight. Also, I think this brings us to another important question when it comes to smart defense. There is kind of a silent discussion inside the alliance, what type of a war will be the next war? I mean, funnily enough, there are even people who are worried that when Afghanistan winds down, and you know, NATO today is kept together by operations, that there will not be another operation. I'm saying to them, don't worry. The world is an unstable place enough. The next conflict will come about. Not that we like it to come about, but it will come about. And the question is only how well we are prepared for this conflict. But the fact is that people are not afraid of the high-end wars. They are not afraid of the Afghan wars, simply because high-end, they don't believe it will happen. Afghanistan, if something like that happens, they will try to avoid it, not to fight it. So the question is, what's the next war? And basically, the only example people are using is Libya. Quick, small, clean, no civilian casualties, no casualties from our side. That's the future war. And of course, if you take that as a premise, then you can decrease high-end capabilities, you can decrease various other capabilities, you can bring down your defense spending without fearing that you go against your own sort of security perceptions or threat perception. And that is something which is of great concern to a country like Estonia, who believes that the alliance should have all types of capabilities. And the question for Estonia in Chicago is, would the smart defense ideas be enough to compensate for the loss of these capabilities? And the answer is obviously no. I mean, if smart defense would be so smart, we would have done it before. The fact is that we are doing it today because we have seriously run out of money. You know, most of the aspects and premises of smart defense have been done throughout the Cold War. I mean, AVAX, for instance, it's a classical smart defense project. Interoperability, for instance. Today, it's called Connected Forces project. It's exactly the same stuff. You need to put in money to make it work. Let me touch upon other issue very quickly, and this is Afghanistan, which was mentioned by my distinguished French colleague. There's no doubt the key interest of the media will be President Hollande arriving to Chicago. Because, you know, the French government has said, it was still during President Sarkozy, they will withdraw end of 2013. Now they have said they will withdraw end of 2020. So the question is, 2012. Oh, God. So the question is, what kind of a political discussion will there be among the leaders, where some are withdrawing, some are leaving trainers, some are leaving combat troops on the theater? Because today the discussion goes like that. Since our province, the province we are situated in, is calm enough, we can withdraw. But the initial idea was that if your region is calm enough, you go and help the others. I mean, that was the philosophy, what we in shorthand call in together, out together. But the fact is that the political calendars, and I'm not accusing anybody because this is the nature of democratic society, the political calendars have influenced seriously the sort of final home stretch of the Afghan mission. And another point, which will be a very complex issue in Chicago, this is what will happen after 2014. We know that this is arriving, the date is arriving. What will be the mission of the alliance after 2014? There are two aspects to it. Do we do combat or not? We've said clearly, we won't do combat. But then we've said, well, there might be instances where we do a little combat. So the question is, and it's probably true, I mean, all joking aside, it might be unavoidable. for instance, our trainers might have security issues. So the question is, how do we protect them? Force protection issues, for instance. But this hasn't been worked out, really. And the last point, it's about money. You know, we have promised that we will pay Afghans a sizable chunk of money so that they can keep up their own defense forces, which I think is a good bargain. It's much cheaper than keeping our forces there. Estonia has also made a financial commitment on that issue. But the problem is we are not ready to pay as much as is necessary. There will be a certain number of people, a large number of people, whom we have trained, but we are not ready to pay for them. We are leaving it to the Afghan government. So we can only hope that the Afghan government will find enough money so that everybody who is at the moment member of the ANSF will be in service after 2014. Because if that is not the case, then we have a large number of people with guns whom we have trained in our own procedures, knowing everything we know, which will be on the street. And that is, I think, a major risk. So basically, there are a lot of things which we will say in Chicago, and there are a lot of things we will not talk about in Chicago, but as I said, I'm talking on a personal
And I'm going to cut in right there. And,
please, sorry.
I'll get you to talk about it a bit later on, perhaps. Damon, the last man down the line often has the hardest job because everything's been said before them, but you actually have a lot of questions to sort of deal with. One is there a scramble for the exit by the Europeans? Second, are the Americans scrambling out of Europe?
You know, I think we have to think about how does this alliance work and go back to the fundamentals to think about the health of this alliance going forward. A lot of questioning today for various obvious reasons. But this alliance works when the United States leads it. It works if Europe can maintain a degree of global ambition in working with the United States. And I think the reality of the complexity of the security environment today, it works as the alliance gets more savvier about building these global partnerships. I think these three pillars are key to going forward with a successful alliance. Is it at risk? And I think it depends on the approach the United States takes and the response and the outlook of many of our European allies. And in this respect, somehow the formal agenda at Chicago doesn't really address this potential growing rift. You've got a credibility of NATO under strain that's threatened by the debt crisis, defense cuts, the so-called pivot to Asia, discussion of weakened military capabilities, sapping the ambitions for global leadership of the West here. And it calls into question some of these fundamentals. It makes Gates' warning ring true of a dim, if not dismal, future if the alliance doesn't act. And I think Chicago has to be the platform from which the allies begin to act and take that on. And I think as much as it's easy to criticize the alliance and to criticize our allies, you have to think about, despite the shortcomings, NATO remains the home of the most capable, most willing allies that the United States has globally, of shared values, community of democracies and global prosperity. And if you step back and you look at where we are today, our allies have been fighting in Afghanistan for over a decade continuously. That was something that would have been unimaginable. You just couldn't imagine that you could have had your European allies, Canadian allies with you for a decade in Asia before 9/11. Second, at a Lisbon summit, the last Lisbon summit, it was again unimaginable that the alliance, with the fatigue and weariness of Afghanistan, would find itself engaged in an operation in Libya shortly after that Lisbon summit. And yet it did, and it did so successfully. So it's easy to criticize what's happening in the alliance, and I think there's serious issues that have to be tackled. But at the same time, if we step back and look at this from an American national security perspective, there's no one else out there that would be doing this with us, that could do this with us. And so rather than bitch and moan about the failures of some of this, we got to figure out how to make the best out of it and how to be able to get through a period which is going to be tough, of dramatic defense cuts, of sapping and lacking ambition of our European partners, and the questioning of a U.S. leadership role in Europe. I think part of this hinges on how the United States handles it. And as we see ourselves as a leader of the alliance and as a European power, it will help us, I think, to continue to leverage the Europeans playing a key role with us on the global agenda. as we look forward to a more complex world, I think a stronger, more ambitious, and more united transatlantic partnership is actually more important today for how the United States thinks about shaping the future, in which the West actually accounts for a relatively smaller share of the global population, global economy, and even military might. And for us to be able to thrive in this complex world, I think we need that strong, ambitious Europe as a partner of ours going forward. So if you look at Chicago, I think it actually leaves out a bit of an agenda that we have to think about taking forward. Afghanistan has to be at the top, no doubt. That's the existential challenge for the alliance right now. How do you wrap this down in a way that doesn't allow the Taliban? How do you conclude a war without allowing the Taliban to return? Capabilities.
Can I just ask you, are you worried about the French pulling out early?
Absolutely, absolutely. I think at the end of the day, the storyline of this alliance is based on solidarity and trust. And the concept of trying to stick together in Afghanistan is at the core of this. Now, I think a French president arriving in the U.S. president's hometown 2 weeks after his inauguration, we can't afford to have this be the epic clash and disagreement on Afghanistan. There has to be a way to stitch together this, the messaging and the reality that we're going to be in this as allies as we're coming to winding down, but it can't happen on a unilateral basis. So I think this is one of the key challenges. It is the arrival of President Hollande has replaced what folks are worried about, potentially the arrival of Putin, as the most challenging issue for Obama to manage in Chicago.
Okay, Benoît wanted to jump in.
Yes, scrambling for exit. First, the French have not been the first to announce the departure, but more profoundly, 2014, 2013, 2012 is an issue about what is the credibility of the Afghan forces. And so far, we have been discussing about the number and about the years. In fact, everybody understands that the performance of the Afghan forces will be strongly linked with the credibility of the political arrangement in Kabul. And that is the main issue, and probably we have lost a lot of time. And in fact, when we are speaking about the financial demand for contribution of training the Afghan, there are a lot of dispute about the size of the Afghan army, and in fact, even the Americans have changed their numbers. Second, the problem of the exit is also a logistical problem. Given the fact that Pakistan will remain a big factor in the Afghan crisis in the years to come, we are looking, everybody is looking about also Russia, not only the Antonov plane, but also the land road. One of the questions is, for the time being, as I have said, the Russians have interest about a smooth transition in Afghan. But they will be tempted to ask for some political bargaining chip at some point, and that is an important element for. Now, on the European capability, that's depend on the. I am less pessimistic than Derek, because that's depend on the kind of war we will be fighting in the future. We are seeing much more the challenge of, from a French point of view, of the Sahel, the kind of crisis we had in Ivory Coast, and I think we were rather good on that, or the piracy in Somalia, which are complex political military challenge, where the sophistication of the military equipment is one of the factors, but not the only factor. And I think that's the kind of I would say, very powerful projection of power at distance is very attractive from the military, because they feel that they have absolute leeway. But in fact, politically, if only about the collateral damage, which reducing them is now a primary operational requirement, is quite limit the effectiveness of that. So I think it's a rather complex situation we will be facing in discussion in the.
Let me interrupt you, and actually I'm not going to go down the line again because I'm determined to beat Konstantin's record of 35 minutes for questions. So what I'll do is, we've all got lots of questions, and I'm sure the other panelists want to say things, but I'd like to hear from the audience. So are there any questions? There's one right here. Do we have the microphones? Sorry, microphones at the back. Put one microphone here, please. It's right here.
Yes, thank you. Artis Lenč from Latvian MP now, former director of the Latvian Institute of International Affairs. Some people in this room can remember more than 40 years ago what happened in South Vietnam when the Americans and the Allies left. Okay? The South Vietnamese army was strong, well-armed, it had advisors, and it collapsed. Actually, when the Soviets left in '89 from Afghanistan, it only took just took 2 years for the Najibullah government to fall. The communist army was strong, Afghan communist army was strong, but it didn't help. So why should in this case, Afghanistan be different than South Vietnam and the former communist Afghanistan government? And by the way, Pakistan was mentioned. Isn't the problem of Afghanistan actually, doesn't the root cause lie in the conflict between India and Pakistan? I won't go into the details, but I think you know the story.
Thank you very much. Yes, please.
Thank you. I'm Merle Maigra. I work at NATO headquarters. I have a question to the panel. Something you did not discuss about is partnership and further enlargement. I think we all share the view that enlargement is not going to be on the agenda of this summit, although there will be a meeting of the 4 aspirant countries' foreign ministers. But I wanted to hear your opinions about the future potentials of NATO enlargement. Could that potentially be on the list for the next summit, perhaps? And if so, who and how? That would be interesting. Thanks.
Okay, let's have one more question. Is there anybody from the region, perhaps, that wants to ask a question about Afghanistan, Pakistan? Okay, yes, sir. We'll just hold on for the microphone to get to you.
Thank you. Najam Sethi from Pakistan. Echo your comments. The US and Pakistan have serious issues right now. It seems that these issues are not going to be easily resolved, and even if they are, they're probably going to be resolved in the short term rather than in the longer term. Pakistan suspects that it is the one country that is going to suffer or benefit in the aftermath of your withdrawal. In other words, it has the largest stake of any country in that region. And for that reason, it is being stubborn, difficult, and is not buying the line that the Americans are offering. And to add to the comments that you made, I think there are going to be even more serious problems because the Pakistanis are not going to give up their support for the Taliban, and they will want a very formidable and an important ringside role for themselves. And this is a very worrying dimension, considering that the US is talking directly to the Taliban. The Karzai government is talking directly to the Taliban. The trilateral dialogue is not taking central position. So all these issues are going to impinge very drastically on what happens from now until 2014 and, of course, subsequently after that. I mean, the communist government lasted for 3 years. This time, nobody should leave a vacuum there. So there has to be a settlement and a negotiated settlement with the Taliban before 2014.
So can I just ask, Najam, what would be your advice to NATO right now? Stay longer, leave quickly? I mean, what's the prescription that comes out of your analysis?
Well, the simple prescription is, and this is not one that I would have favored many years ago, I would have liked to see the end of the Taliban, frankly. But now my position is that there is no end to the Taliban. They have to be accommodated. They represent Pashtun nationalism because they're the only ones opposed to foreign intervention. The other elements of the Pashtuns are on the other side. So therefore, apart from the ethnic factor, the potential of division of Afghanistan, it's very important to bring the Taliban into the loop. And that can only happen with a negotiated settlement. So talk, fight, no, I think it has to move closer to talk. But I don't see that happening anytime in the near future.
Okay, thank you very much. Let's go to the panel. Let's start from the right.
Sure, let me pick up quickly on AFPAC and then come to the enlargement partnership agenda. In Afghanistan, if our withdrawal is like South Vietnam or like Iraq, we're making a huge strategic blunder. And I think the way that we manage the drawdown here is critically important so that there is an enduring relationship. There is an enduring presence. The United States has concluded its enduring agreement with Afghanistan. NATO is working on the same. The nature of our presence after combat has officially ended at 2014 is crucially important so that we actually don't see the return of the Taliban to governance, a role in Afghanistan perhaps, not governance in Afghanistan. And so I think we have to manage this drawdown in a way that's dramatically different from how we handled South Vietnam, and particularly Iraq, or we'll pay a huge strategic price after having invested a decade in it. And I think that's one of the key issues to get right at Chicago, that we're not signaling to our people that we're done and we're walking out. The Pakistan part of this makes it tough because Pakistan's actions are what have helped sap the public support in the West for our continued presence. And today, Pakistan's blockage of any resupply of our forces in Afghanistan is the #1 challenge that's helping to undermine the alliance operation in Afghanistan. And so I think we're in a very bad way with Islamabad right now. Getting that right is not going to be easy, but I think it's actually something that's undermining support in allied capitals for a continued presence, and it continues to be putting that at risk. The enlargement and partnership agenda, I'm glad you raised it because I think this is key. I think it's actually been a disastrous rhetoric for NATO officials to be walking around and saying Chicago's not an enlargement summit. The reality is there have been 3 enlargement summits since 1999. By walking around and saying Chicago's not an enlargement summit, we're actually trying to push it and bury it down. There's no need for that. The aspirants have actually earned it through their performance, and the fact is that we can't lose sight of what the whole vision and purpose behind enlargement has been. It's the vehicle of creating this Europe whole, free, and at peace that stabilizes Europe, brings more security to the unstable, once vulnerable countries, and by definition then makes NATO actually stronger. So I think there is an enlargement agenda, both for Chicago and beyond, that begins with a leaders meeting. It will happen at foreign ministers. I would have liked to have seen it at leaders. Continues with a declaration with really strong language that validates the open door policy as not only having been a success, but the open doors being a cornerstone for continued security in Europe. That touches on the 3 countries, particularly the dramatic progress Montenegro has made in 2 years in the map. I would have liked to have signaled a decision that Georgia's pathway to membership is through the NATO-Georgia Commission, the urgency of resolving the Macedonian name issue, and actually giving a map to Bosnia as it meets the final benchmark on federal control of defense properties. But what you could do in Chicago to give an impetus to this and not just say, oh, it's not an enlargement decision, is you could set out a vision and say all the countries of the Western Balkans one day, if they so desire, will be welcomed into the alliance if they meet the obligations, responsibilities. An explicit statement that signals that first enlargement doesn't lead to divisions in the region, but really provides a NATO equivalency of the Thessaloniki vision that the European Union set out to include Serbia and Kosovo. And second, you could take a decision, which I think would be appropriate, to signal that in 2014 at the next NATO summit, we'd be prepared to take decisions on enlargement. Because by 2014, I think a country like Montenegro could be ready. And more seriously, what happens the day after Chicago is we need to see a serious campaign begin by NATO officials, U.S. officials, to really work with the aspirants to ensure that they are more prepared for a decision in 2014 and that we've got the alliance more prepared. Maybe I'll stop right there since we've got more to come back to, but I think partnership policy, Chicago is the opening of something that's dramatic and important because it breaks down the geographical stovepipes, and by bringing together countries from Asia, the Middle East, North Africa, and Europe, it begins to signal the future of what a globalized partnership arrangement needs to be. I actually think it could be more ambitious and have some ideas on that, but I'll save that for later.
Would you like to say something on?
Yep.
Pick up one of those questions?
On partnership, I agree with everything Damon said about enlargement. I must say that Rasmussen speaking about the NATO not being an enlargement summit, I have to be fair about it. It is a trade-off. I mean, the fact that we say, I think even I have said it, that NATO is not an enlargement summit also means that this allows us to negotiate some of the moves in Chicago, which allow us to take the enlargement agenda forward. So in some ways it's political, but it's also a fact. NATO is not an enlargement summit.
So can you, just for those who may not entirely be familiar, what is exactly the trade-off that was made?
Well, the trade-off what was made is that I think we get good language, as Damon said. And we are getting foreign ministers meeting, which is in NATO shorthand called 28+4. You know that there are countries who want, for instance, A, not to discuss enlargement at all, or B, to discuss it but to cast aside Georgia. We have now got a foreign ministers meeting where the whole group of countries who are aspirants are there together and are capable to discuss on a high political level, I would have liked it to be higher as well, the enlargement issue. And I think this is, for instance, quite a good achievement. But we obviously would like the agenda to go forward as quickly as possible, much quicker than it is today. Another partnership issue, and let me touch upon very briefly, of course, our notable partners today are those in the Arab League. You know that Arab League has started to play a very interesting role in politically cooperating with NATO and even militarily cooperating with NATO, as it happened in Libya. The question is, do we manage to discuss those issues of that region in Chicago? There are two issues, Syria and Libya. I don't think there will be Syria discussion because there is a feeling among several members that if NATO starts to discuss something, it is an automatic reference to the fact that we'll go in and something happens tomorrow. So even the discussion itself is seen as threatening. I'm saying to these people, look, you overestimate NATO. We can discuss things and nobody believes that we'll do something. But there are some countries who are very, very cautious about it. So if nothing extremely dramatic doesn't happen in Syria, and of course dramatic happens every day in Syria, but on a sort of a certain level, if there wouldn't be an enormous spike of anything, I doubt whether Chicago will be the forum for Syria discussions, sadly. Libya, considered as a very successful operation, but the fact is that things are happening in Libya today which do not allow it to cast as a poster operation. I still think NATO did a good job in Libya. I think Stephen Erlanger said that we have changed Libya, but we have sort of cast it aside now, left it on its own devices. But we have been forced to do that by the fact that Libyan government has clearly said, we don't want any role of NATO post-operation. We don't want your troops here. If there is a specific assistance on, military training, we will tell it to you. They want to do it themselves. And I think they are right to try to do it themselves. Because this is actually the only way how countries come about. We are not able to build a country. So I hope they succeed, and I think they haven't actually done so badly, regardless of the specific incidents, which have specific political background. So Libya is there as a good operation, but I'm sure it will not be discussed in Chicago as well. Thanks.
Thank you. Unless anyone wants to jump in right away, I'll just go back to the audience. So there's a question here, and then one to the President.
Thanks. Stephen Flanagan. I'm from the Center for Strategic and International...
Can you speak the microphone a bit closer?
I'm Stephen Flanagan from the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington. I wanted to add a comment on the capabilities question and then a question about how we sustain some of those capabilities. And I guess on the question of the U.S. pivot or the rebalancing, which is really the preferred politically correct term in Washington about what's happening with our diplomatic and military assets. I think Tomas's comment, I thought was a little bit overstated, the notion that future conflicts will be more bloody and more demanding on European allies because of this shift, fewer enablers on the part of the U.S. I mean, when you look at wholesale, what's being talked about in the Pentagon is the shift of the current balance roughly of about 60% of the assets being oriented now towards Europe and the Middle East, and 40% in Asia. That balance over the 10-year period is going to shift in the other direction. So, but it doesn't mean that also that those assets can't be repositioned in times of crisis, and we've seen that happen before in different cases, including with regard to Afghanistan or the tsunami relief and other things. So it's not as if these assets are no longer completely out of question. But there's also, I think to me, that there was alluded to earlier that the lessons of Libya showed that actually there was a fair amount of capability within the alliance, even without the most robust U.S. participation. The key enablers were certainly provided in refueling and support to some of the strike missions. But a number of other allies showed that they really were quite capable of undertaking these strike missions fairly effectively. So it wasn't pretty, it wasn't perfect, but it actually came together quite well. But now I think the key question is, as we look at smart defense, and I'd be interested particularly in Ambassador Luik's perspectives on this, is we do know that we're going to see a continuing flatness, if at best, in defense spending throughout the alliance, and even rather sluggish growth, or even perhaps some tougher decisions on the U.S. side. But how do we maintain, now that we have some sense of what some of the critical capabilities are that we need within the alliance, and if smart defense is going to be more than a slogan, how are we going to sustain that over the next decade to ensure that we have this vision that's being talked about, this NATO force for 2020? Do you see new willingness, and obviously all of you could comment on this, do we see new willingness on the part of the alliance to be more transparent in defense planning, to ensure that we do have those critical capabilities that we're working to identify now that will be needed for these future contingencies, and what about the political willingness to use them?
Okay, and the lady in front of you. Okay.
Okay, Rina Kianka, the European External Action Service. There's been a lot of talk of the NATO Lisbon Summit, but there was another Lisbon Summit as well in recent years, and that was the European Union's summit that concluded the Lisbon Treaty that set up the European External Action Service as well as the post of the High Representative. Now we know that in the EU the Common Foreign and Security Policy remains a competence of the member states, but we also listen to what the panel says about the Europeans needing to pony up more after Chicago, after the rebalancing, as Steve puts it, of the U.S. toward Asia. Given this situation, what is the EU's added value in the security field to the panelists' point of view, and what advice would you give High Representative Lady Ashton? Thank you.
Thank you. President Ilves.
Thank you. Two separate points. One on the pivot. In general, if you look at the dynamics of political discussions, if in July Robert Gates says, pay up or we have to rethink this, and then in October in foreign policy Hillary Clinton says, well, we're going to look toward Asia. Those were not isolated and unconnected statements. Maybe we should have a little reality check here in Europe. I mean, there are 5 countries, that's less than 20% of the members of the allies actually meet their obligations. It's an extreme minority. And we see that basically maybe Europe is not ready to pay for its defense. Let's be honest. In fact, if the argument is, well, we can't do it because it's such a difficult time at home, well, then how difficult is it then for those countries that do meet their obligations, and how much pressure do we have? We, the 5 that do. And I'm actually kind of annoyed at this, because it is kind of a struggle at home when you say, well, all those other people don't pay. And then you have to say, yes, but this is a commitment. Well, it's not really a commitment, no one else is doing it. Let's this scale down. Forget this talk about going other places. I mean, no one is willing to make a commitment. I mean, on top of that, we have the caveats, which people put into NATO missions. And let's face it, we're just in a period of decline because every other continent is arming or rearming, increasing its defense expenditures. And we don't want to do it. I mean, Lutwak said this about, 18 years ago. Where's the European defense? Everyone's at home minding their children. We don't want to risk. We don't want to pay. Then why should the fools here, especially the ones in Europe, because the United States has a broad agenda, but we in Europe are just worried about Europe. Why should we be paying 2% if most of the countries are not willing to do it? Maybe we should just then say, okay, let's all do 1.2%, and we'll agree we don't do anything out of area, and this is just the core task. I mean, it would kind of strike me as being a rational approach. It's not my approach, but certainly I think it's schizophrenic. We're schizophrenic when we talk about all of these operations, and at the same time, it comes down to the UK, France, Bulgaria, and Estonia. I mean, that's kind of an odd group.
Don't forget Greece.
And Greece, okay. Well, I mean, I give them a break, but I mean, And the other issue, I just hope that when we get to the Chicago summit, we don't forget the immortal words of President Medvedev in last October or so, which should come to haunt a lot of countries after the Bucharest summit, when he said point blank, yes, we invaded Georgia to prevent NATO enlargement. I mean, he said this. I mean, it's not like, oh, they're not ready, or we have to think more about this. It's the fact, the Russian president, who was president at the time, admitted, unless you don't really need to take into account what people say and you don't believe them, but I would say if the Russian president twice in one day says, we invaded Georgia to prevent NATO enlargement, I do hope this factoid is brought to the table when we discuss the future enlargement, and let's not mix it up with all kinds of discussions of, oh, are we ready to enlarge at this point or not? It's quite clear what's going on. It's a lot more brutal and simple than the kind of niceties that we've been talking about. Anyway, just those two little things.
Thank you very much. So, Russia, are we in terminal decline? What should Cathy Ashton do or not do? And is there anything that can be done better in defense planning? Who wants to start? Tomas.
I can start perhaps, given one of the questions was addressed to me directly. Stephen, we can quibble over what exact adjective to attach to sort of describing the military consequences of the U.S. rebalancing, but the bottom line remains, wars fought without the U.S. enablers will take longer. They will cause more civilian casualties, which we don't want to cause, and they will cost more in allied lives. That's a fact. The main reason we shouldn't quibble about it, though, is because I agree with fundamentally with the premise. I think the U.S. rebalancing is both right and overdue. There's simply no reason, as President Ilves just said, that a collection of countries that are both as economies larger than the United States should not be providing more for their defense. So I think in balance, the United States is absolutely right to ask the Europeans to do more. The fact that I lay out the difficulties entailed doesn't mean that it's the wrong thing to do. I simply wanted to point out that it won't be easy, and it requires that we think a lot more creatively about how it is that we organize our defenses, which brings me to my second point on smart defense. We haven't quite... We've been too complimentary of smart defense so far. We occasionally drop a funny moniker here and there to suggest that it's not all right. So let's get into the details. The reality is most of the projects that I have seen that are going to be unveiled in Chicago are quite disappointing. The idea behind smart defense is that countries, by working together, are going to create economies of scale and efficiencies that will never completely make up for the amount of money that was taken out of defense budgets, but will at least make it offset the impact of budget cuts to some extent. And the reality is that the reality has fallen far short of the ambitions. Again, the collaborative projects I have seen ready for Chicago were pretty disappointing. I think we've gone about smart defense the wrong way, or not the wrong way. We haven't gone quite far enough. The idea behind smart defense, NATO's approach on smart defense so far, has been one of letting states work out what they want to do on the assumption that they're adult and smart enough to figure out that this matters, that smart defense is important, and they need to overcome the political hurdles that multinational collaboration generates. But that hasn't happened. They've been too shy. For reasons that you will be very familiar with, Jüri, Smart defense makes a strategic sense. It's the best answer we have to the economic crisis. But when you're defense minister and you look at collaboration with another country across the border, you see nothing but trouble. You see issues of sovereignty, who decides on where the joint unit is going to go to battle. Is it going to be a joint decision, my decision, or the other countries? Am I going to get dragged into wars that I don't want to fight? Am I going to be let down by my partner in the wars that I do want to fight? Is my partner going to free ride and leave me in lurch and investing all the money and the other country doing nothing? How do I justify this to my finance ministers? Because these collaborative projects often cost more to put in place before they save you money in the long run. We've just seen this week the UK abandoning the decision to refit its aircraft carriers, when one of the reasons why it chose the refit in the first place was to make it easier to work with France for French aircraft to land on UK carriers. That's been abandoned. The startup costs were too high. They walked away from that. The cooperation now won't happen to the extent that it should have happened. The bottom line is, to the defense ministers, collaboration is nothing but trouble. It makes strategic sense, but not necessarily political and economic sense. And what NATO hasn't done, what it ought to have done, is get into the defense ministers' decision-making cycle, into their heads, and start addressing some of their fears and giving them incentives to collaborate. I think we should have thought more creatively whether we can use the existing security investment fund in NATO, the fund that pays for things like pipelines that connect NATO's airports. Could we have used that to offset some of the startup costs of collaboration? What can NATO do in terms of defense planning? Can the defense planners not simply give the countries an assessment of their own defenses? Can the defense planners also point out what opportunities for collaboration exist in a given region? That's something that could be done, isn't being done. I simply think NATO needs to be a lot more hands-on. Smart defense is too important a project in some ways to be left to the governments. We have left it to the government so far, with some exceptions like the Baltic states and the Nordic states and the Benelux states. Very few countries have done what was expected. I think we need to be a lot more hands-on.
You almost seem to be suggesting NATO needs a sort of, a NATO version of the European Commission, trying to find the common good for NATO. Yes, Benoît.
Well, everybody knows why NATO and EU dialogue has been so thin. But I must point that the EU has done a number of operations in place where NATO was not willing to go, and which were successful and still doing for the PRC. But also there has been a recent move which are a bit underground and not well known. But for example, EDRC, this is a pooling of all the tactical transportation capacity of a certain number of countries. In fact, it was even used in Libya to evacuate all of the foreigners. This is not known. There, for the first time, the Commission and the European Defence Agency have agreed to talk about using the R&D program, which are quite substantial, for a defense-related issue. 3 years ago, it was absolutely taboo. Now there is a group of working on that. Pooling and sharing. This has been an initiative of the European Defence Agency. And if it succeeds on air tanker, for example, capacity, it will be something big. Now, therefore, I don't think we should underestimate the potential for the European waking up on security. One of the issues which, and I think the President is right, is that the public opinion is, in the various European countries, is not agreeing on what is the area of security, the main interest of security of Europe. In France, we were totally shocked to consider that half of the alliance was seeing the Libyan revolution and the risk of Srebrenica in Benghazi as not something of interest for the European, even from the humanitarian side. Europe has taken at least 4 years to wake up about a civil war in the Balkans at its doors. just over the Mediterranean Sea, we had a really urgent humanitarian problem and a political problem because Gaddafi was a troublemaker in the whole area since a long time. Really, I think the people we have to decide to assess where our fundamental security interests lie. Maritime freedom of maritime transportation and navigation in the Indian Ocean against piracy is of our economic interest. So spending for a few naval operation and giving a lot of small money to the Somali and Mauritius and so on in order to try to is even cost benefit because it's the insurance. People are really keen on that. So there is a lot of things which can be done, and I am sure they will be done in the coming years because it's the reality check. We need to do those kind of things because our interests are. We are surprised about the isolationism of a certain number of countries in the alliance about the European environment.
Just before I leave you, do you want to pick up the point about Cathy Ashton and what the External Action Service should be doing?
I think that first, the Lisbon Treaty had one ambition, is to put the Commission money into also security issues, because those two the bureaucracy of the Commission was not willing to, because it was ideological, they was willing to fund development. And now we understand that development cannot be ensured without security. And now it is slowly, they are slowly working together, and the priority of security should be the new theme of development. We cannot go again on financing coffee plantation when you have people which are on civil war in Ivory Coast.
Thank you. Damon, you want to say
Sure,
something?
I just wanted a couple points. First of all, I want to say it's such a pleasure to agree with Ambassador Daboville on his perspective on Libya. I strongly agree with what you said. But I wanted to pick up a couple of things that President Ilves said. I mean, the reality is the alliance is caught right now in a race to the bottom on defense spending, and it's bad. And so you can look at smart defense, and the reality is, to steal a phrase from a U.S. vice presidential candidate, smart defense it is lipstick on a pig. But the purpose that we face right now is how, in a time of extreme fiscal austerity, do you minimize damage so you protect some core capabilities, develop some key enablers that we know we need from Libya, that you make it through this period. And I think what we want to see in countries whose defense spending have gone down, and kudos to Estonia, which is now going to hit 2% at the end of this year, that you need to see defense budgets that show a trend line upwards as their economies begin to come back, as the Brits have actually done, that give us a perspective that there will be reinvestment in defense. And so while it's not good, it's not a good picture today, we want to see that trajectory in the future. And even today, the Transatlantic Alliance still accounts for 2/3 of global defense spending, 54% of global economic output, and Europe alone does 50% of development aid. There's not much of a decline. We're still the big guys on the block, and Brazil, Indonesia, and India aren't replacing you anytime soon in many of these categories. The second point was on Russia, and I think the President's point on Russia is particularly important as you think about an enlargement, a Europol and free agenda, which is not done in Europe. As we come incredibly close to achieving this 20-year project of a Europol and free, now's not the time to get cold feet and stop as it gets a little bit more difficult. The experience that we had in the run-up to the 2008 war with Georgia was not that all of a sudden this war came as a surprise. There were provocative Russian statements, provocative Russian actions, and the lead-up to that war that we were completely aware of. The issue had become that we had become so used to seeing provocative Russian statements, provocative Russian actions, that we took it as normal course of duty and they could get away with it. Well, if the American Chad had said what the Russian Chad said last week about missile defense, there'd be an incredible global reaction. And yet what do? We shrug our shoulders. We take it for granted that we expect to hear this. And I think that's one of the things where we have to be cognizant that when we do have some of the outrageous statements coming out of our Russian counterparts, We don't need to go provoke or be confrontational, but we need to be firm and clear about calling them on that and sticking.
What would you have said? What would you have said in response to that specific? What would you have said in response to that specific?
So in this case, one, I think to call it on the mat. It's outrageous to talk about offensive use of action against these missile defense facilities, which are targeted for Middle Eastern threats, and not to let it slide by, but to call them on that, to protest that. But in policy terms, not to shy away from what we're doing, for example, on the enlargement agenda, that we still have business to finish, and that we stick to that, and we be clear that we're moving forward with that. The third thing I just would add is that, as Jüri pointed out, Chicago, what's not on the agenda in Chicago, I think Syria, Libya, these are huge issues. These should be first and foremost on our agenda. And that there are serious challenges to our security right now. And anything that's a challenge to our allies' security, we should be able to talk about at NATO without being scared that we're implying NATO is moving towards action. Particularly in a case like Turkey, this is a real issue for a NATO ally. And it's offensive that we not take that seriously and talk about it in an alliance context, particularly out of respect for a NATO ally, but because it hits a greater interest. And second, on Libya, it's true. It is, many of these countries are saying, look, we don't want you to come, we don't want your boots on the ground. But I still think it's incumbent upon us to be in there working with them to help them formulate a way, well, what is a way you'd be comfortable with us helping you? The roles that the militaries have played in these transitions in the Arab world have been fundamental to determining their outcome. And I think we have to think that the role that the military is going to play in these societies going forward is critical. And rather than wash our hands of it, we've got to figure out how to get in there and use some of these partnership for peace tools to work with these militaries in their evolution of these societies.
Jüri, there was a couple of specific points about cooperation. I mean, on the one hand, you can see Baltic cooperation as an example. On the other hand, some people think it's moving backwards. So, is there something that can be done in this region, the more that should be done in this region? Indeed, when we talk about Russia, when you hear people in the region talk about, what they still perceive to be as a real threat, are the Baltic states themselves falling far short of what they should be doing? It's all very well to congratulate yourself on 2%, but countries that feel threatened, generally threatened, spend 3, 4, 5, 6, 7% of GDP.
Let me start by responding to Steve Flanagan. I mean, when it comes to smart defense, I still believe that what was practiced during the Cold War is basically the only way to do smart defense. You might say that NATO as an idea is based on smart defense. I believe that defense spending is very much function of sovereignty spending. I mean, you can go to your people and say, we have to buy this and that. It's very difficult to go and say, well, together with a number of nations, we buy a specific device, etc., etc. It's far too complicated. That's why I think that what works best is if everybody retains their own sovereignty over a certain capability. And a very good example is, of course, Baltic air policing operation. You have countries providing the planes, you have countries providing the host nation support. The tasks are clear, and the sovereignty of those assets is very clear as well, although they are given to NATO's operational line of command. So I think that's the best way of smart defense, and Baltic air policing will be highlighted in Chicago as one good example of smart defense. When it comes to Russia, which was mentioned by President Ilves, I have spoken about it before. I don't think it will be discussed in Chicago. If you ask whether it will be discussed, it will not be discussed in Chicago. But I think we are making a mistake, and in some ways we are also aggravating Russians. Because let's imagine you are shouting at somebody, and this somebody doesn't even notice you. I mean, he just walks by you, and you sort of send a signal, whatever you do, I don't care. So what is the choice of this person who is shouting? He has to shout more and more and more. There is this feeling that you don't get through. I think we should respond, as Damon said, clearly, calmly, but to all those very aggressive statements. I think that's a matter of security for us, but it's also smart policy. It's smart diplomacy. It's not aggravating. It might, on the fact, reduce the tensions. So, but that's not something where we would have many supporters in the alliance. So we have to admit that. And when it comes to defense spending, which has also been mentioned here, I mean, the US role in the pool of NATO defense assets is growing and growing. And by default, as I said before, we are relying on the United States on almost any operation which NATO might come face to face to. But we do it silently, because if we would say it, President called for honesty and openness, if we would say it and would explain our own low defense spending with that, obviously there would be a number of political questions, quite rightly so, in the United States. So we'd be creating a politically unsustainable situation. We don't do that. We do it smartly. It's part of the smart defense, so to say. We try to spend less and rely very much to the United States.
Thank you. There were some questions on this side. Let's go over here. There's one here and then one for the lady. Okay, I'll come to you next.
Okay, thank you. Margarita Mathiopoulos, I'm coming from a country which would prefer not to deal with defense at all. I'm coming from Germany. I'm running a company which is dealing with defense issues, and I'm one of these rare species which is still an Atlanticist in my country. Coming back to the President's comment and Stephen Flanagan's comments, I would like to add a comment and ask a question on smart defense. I remember very well 10 years ago, this was called a Defense Capabilities Initiative, which was basically the same thing, and I think they were the same countries, same 5 countries maybe, who did their homework and the rest didn't. And I'm afraid my country was also in the camp of the countries which was not necessarily completed its efforts in that respect. So when we compare the European Union, the Eurozone, and NATO today, we came to the conclusion through the crisis, the financial crisis in Europe, we have to sanction certain countries, and we ask them, especially our friends on the southern European front, to do their homework. Otherwise, if they don't do the fiscal, if they don't keep their fiscal budgets in shape, maybe they should think of leaving. Now, in NATO, Stephen Flanagan was very polite, trying to say we should identify where we could work together on smart defense capabilities. I'm not so optimistic, so I would just like to ask, especially our American friends, why don't you behave like we Germans? We tell our friends on the financial aspects to get their act together, and maybe one day we will wake up and you tell us we should also get our act together.
Thank you. And then over here.
One word which was not mentioned here, Eugeniusz Smolar from Warsaw, Polish Institute for International Affairs, was burden sharing. This is the, I don't know, maybe Jüri can enlighten us, but it would solve some of the European problems because some of the countries are more willing than others to go and do some real fighting, but the financial constraints makes that they have to make a choice whether to rebuild their armed forces, modernize them, or actually participate in another mission somewhere. Burden sharing within the alliance, that means certain inner loyalty, would help to alleviate this problem. Now, probably I have too good a memory or maybe a bad character, but I want to mention that we are talking about the US strategy. We have been living through several US strategies in Afghanistan.
We've got about 3 minutes left. Can I ask you just to cut to the question?
Okay, no, but I think this is pretty important because it's about decision making within the alliance. All changes of strategy were made one-sidedly by the American presidents, and the last one was the one who promised openness, cooperative approach, etc. After consulting some American generals, firing one for known reasons, you know, getting another one, the new was announced in the White House. This is not the way how some Europeans would like to see this cooperation within NATO. The last was, I'm worried about France, frankly speaking. I don't know at the moment where France will be going when cooperation with NATO is concerned. Can I remind you, because again of long memories, when you were, and this title should be mentioned here, representative ambassador at NATO, it was famous in the NATO corridors, a very negative approach in different commissions of France reacting to Anglo-Saxon proposals. Now, when France joined NATO, I was in Paris and I asked Deputy Foreign Minister how much support there is for the President Sarkozy decision, and he says, not much. And I said, how many of you? I said, about 3, and I'm not one of them. I quote directly. Now, with Hollande coming as the president, I wonder whether we are not going to see going back to the more traditional French sort of playing game between the different forces. And the last one, which is a proof, is how the decision was made about Libya. Can we remind you that actually the French president, Sarkozy, have said NATO is not popular in Libya. So we don't want NATO to, and it was President Obama talking to Sarkozy and telling him, you've got 72 hours to make your decision. So we have a problem of decision making within the alliance. Thank you.
Okay, so I'm just going to come straight back to Benoît, and then I'm going to cut into your coffee break. If anybody has anything really urgent to say it, but say it really briefly, like tweet, 140 characters.
Well, I am proud that not only in the corridors, but also in the council chambers, I was opposing Iraq. Imagine that NATO fighting in Iraq, in Afghanistan. I think there should be a plaque for Germany and France for opposing the intervention of NATO in Iraq, given everything we had predicted by destroying a bulwark against Iran has been realized. It has been one of the big failures, and I think we prevented NATO to be too much associated with that. We got a lot of flack about that, but we are proud about this. Now, about Libya, it's extremely important to understand that it was obvious that we will not put a boot on the grounds because the Libyans will not accept it, and they had really conveyed that. So it was air battle. We had the boots on the ground were the Qatari. And the Qatari, so we had a lot of conversation with the Qatari, and with the American, with the British, when we understood. And at the start, it was not an ideological prevention against NATO. Half of NATO was not willing, not even to give the base for the operation at the start, remember. But also it was operational requirement. And then we brought with the Brits NATO into the fold with a lot of difficulty. I remember that when we had to establish the HQ for the operational, we found in Naples there was nothing. The people, the HQ in Naples, they were not accustomed to fight during the weekends. They were going on weekends. We had to supplement the HQ. The computer were not working. We had to bring. So the deploy, really, we had the first 6 or 7 days of the NATO implication were really very hazardous. After everything, because NATO is a good machinery, it takes a lot of time to react, politically, but also military. After it went well. But you have really to go on the history of that, and the history will be clear.
Okay, I know lots of people have things to say and things to ask. Let's try and be really quick and concise, and it actually might be more punchy and interesting.
Okay, well, I'll try to be punchy. I think we have blasted it through dim. We're deeply into dismal and hurtling headlong into whatever's next, dire, delusional, defunct. I don't know. Everything that people have said about the summit and about the actual agenda is dispiriting, I have to say. From the audience on Afghanistan, about smart defense, about where we are in capabilities. We didn't get to missile defense, but we know where that is. Inability to talk about Syria, inability to talk about Russia in any frank way. I know where we are on Article 5 planning. Damon, Jüri, Benoît, you've all given us actually some good ideas on what NATO should do, but you have to compare that against what's realistic. The budgets, the public will, the likeliness of taking on any kind of operation like Syria, there's just nothing there. And so a very serious question is, after the summit's over with, and we've kind of gotten through it, what does NATO really do?
Okay, I'm going to take that. Who's next? Anybody else?
Please. What?
No, I just want to see if there's any more questions. Then I'll come straight back to the panel. Hold on. Stand by. Anybody else? Okay. Yes, one more here.
Keith Smith from CSIS. It's not a question. It's just a follow-up on President Ilves and Damien's comments. And that's a question of Europe and NATO. And not necessarily military action, but political action. And the question that President Ilves raised about the Medvedev's comments on Georgia. And where are we today? We have a situation where missiles are being put into Kaliningrad. Missiles that can, have the capability, and if Russia talks a lot about capabilities, has the ability to strike 400 kilometers in a circle, and some are coming that are going to have greater capabilities. Is NATO discussing this? Is this on the agenda? Is it something that people are going to raise with anybody? Raise that question.
Thank you very much. Okay, I'm going to wrap that up. Go to the panel. Jüri, do you want to address a specific question on missiles? And then we'll go around for any last comments. Missiles deployed Kaliningrad, greater range.
Well, we have certainly raised it many, many times, and it's a matter of great concern for Estonia, as it is for many other countries. I mean, Poland has been very active in this direction. So it's a major problem.
And two things that need to be done after Chicago?
Sorry?
After what needs to happen after Chicago? Like, give us 2 points.
This is clearly a very large and abstract question. Because let's be honest, NATO is an international organization. It's a tool. The question is whether member states want to use this tool. NATO is actually very different from European Union. As you know, a number of competencies the nation states in the European Union have deposited, if you will, to the EU. For instance, let me bring you an example. I read somewhere that in the European Commission there are 33,000 people working. And it's because of several competencies there are under the European Commission. In NATO international staff, the civilians make 1,200, something to that effect. This shows that we are dealing with minuscule part of a sort of a common organization. So it very much depends on countries. And let me be honest, still the leading country is the United States. I mean, because of the United States, the alliance is the strongest military alliance in the world. If there wouldn't be United States as a member, this would be a misnomer. So, I mean, it's very much, in the beginning, it's very much an American decision. Whether the American politicians, sort of from both sides of the aisle, would be ready to use NATO as a tool of security. Thanks.
Damon, there was a specific question about whether the Americans should put sanctions on the European allies.
Right. Let me say a couple of things. So, first of all, I think whenever there's division within the alliance, whether it's split over Iraq or even Germany opting out of Libya, I think that's a strategic failure, not something to be celebrated. And so I think that's a key point. So, the Americans, could Secretary of Gates have been any clearer? He was pretty clear. He said it. We have said it over and over, in fact, to the point where I think we've harangued you. If you listen to any American congressional testimony on NATO, any congressional hearing on NATO, it is all about burden sharing, as American congressmen become a little bit more concerned and skeptical about European defense spending. And so I'm glad you raised the role of Germany, the role of France, and what happens after Chicago. I mean, this is a time where we have to demonstrate, are we willing to recommit to this alliance? And essentially, that means the big guys, who actually are the most responsible stewards for the health of this alliance, What do? On Monday, Nick Burns and I are releasing an Atlantic Council report that speaks to this, the responsibility of the key allies. The U.S. has to remain and be a leader. Can't be a bystander. It has to be a leader, continue to view NATO as a force multiplier. But Germany is the number one issue. Germany's an economic superpower and a military pygmy, as my former boss, Lord Robertson, used to say. And we need to see an increasing, the same level of ambition out of Berlin to influence global events on a political and strategic and military side as it does on an economic side. And until we have that, there's so much unmet potential in this partnership. Germany has come, in historic terms, an incredibly long way through its actions in Kosovo and Afghanistan. But you know what? We accept you as a normal country, and our ambitions are now far higher for you than your ambitions are for your own country. And that's a core problem in the alliance today. Third is the United Kingdom. I mean, this is the linchpin in a United Kingdom that maintains both the ambition to be a global player and the defense investment to be that global player is a key attribute going forward in this alliance and in question today. The fourth part is France. With the election of President Hollande, I want to be reassured, but what we've seen with President Sarkozy is pretty dramatic. It's an Atlanticist France. And the key question facing us, regardless of how we manage Afghanistan now, is will this enduring instinct of France being an Atlanticist country that feels that it can work in cooperation with the United States, that it can pursue its national interests through NATO, does that continue? And if it does, that's a key core ingredient to keeping the alliance healthy. And finally, Turkey. Turkey has arrived. Turkey is the most influential country in the Middle East. It's the only dramatically growing country in the alliance, but we don't treat it as such. It's time for Turkey to assume a position of leadership in the alliance, but with that comes a sense of responsibility that Ankara has to stop importing some of its regional problems, stop blocking European Union, Israel, and be a more responsible leader within the alliance. And with that, then, you have the key countries of Poland, Spain, Italy, Canada. Can these countries, which have been quite helpful, can they really step it up? And I think this is a core recipe for how you keep this alliance healthy going forward beyond Chicago.
Thank you. Thomas, anything, concluding thought?
Two quick points. I'll be brief. First, I strongly agree with Damon. The United States has spoken loud and clear when it came to European capabilities. As former policy director at the Slovak MOD, I was on the receiving end quite a few times. They're being very, very clear when they make their points. Ironically, now that the United States is taking a bit of a backseat, Britain and France are stepping in the role of leaders in Europe. They are also inheriting the US job of haranguing other allies to spend more on defense. And if you follow and read closely Secretary of Defense Philip Hammond's speech in Germany recently, it had echoes of Bob Gates in Brussels in 2010. It was equally tough. Of course, it wasn't quite as eloquent, but it was equally tough on European allies. So watch this space. I agree with Damon. Britain will have to do more heavy lifting, particularly with regard to Germany. Two quick points on your question, Anton, on what should be, or Kurt's question, on what should be on the agenda for Chicago. The ideas I'm going to present, you'll probably tell me I'm in denial. They don't solve NATO's big problems. I agree. I prefer to focus on what's possible rather than obsess over what should be done and can't and won't. There is a host of things we can do to make smart defense smarter. We need to allow defense planners to make the business case for defense collaboration. It would help convince the defense ministries. We need to use the smart defense envoys better. They need to share lessons learned on how you put some of these collaborative projects in place from one country to another. That doesn't happen currently. We need to allow for some use of common funds, as much as Benoît hates them, to offset some of the startup costs of defense collaboration. If we did, we might still have a refit of a UK aircraft carrier. There's half a dozen practical things that I'm going to write about in a paper that will come out in a few days on how smart defense can be made smarter. It won't solve the basic capability problem. It will make a bad situation somewhat less bad.
Thank you. Benoît, do you have a paper coming out?
Yes, I have on reform, in fact, on NATO reform. After Chicago, well, first, there will certainly the success of a limited agenda summit, but which will not provoke a kind of domestic raucous in the U.S. Opinion about having sanctions against the European. So we have to pass. Second will be to continue to implement the Lisbon agenda, which is a vast agenda, including on capacities and the improvement of better use of money. Third, it's definitely solving the issue of nuclear US presence in Europe, which is an issue which has been put out after the summit. Fourth, at least beginning to work seriously with the EU, which is one of the things which since 10 years has not been possible, but it is quite important. And then NATO could transfer from its prison barrack in the new building, which when I was in NATO was costing 300 million, and now it's about 1 billion, which is show the way NATO could manage the money, and another argument against common funding.
Thank you very much. I'm afraid that's all we have time for. Thank you to our... Yeah, absolutely.
Simply, I have to respond once more to Kurt. It is you painted a very dark picture, and I want to say that you have to look at it also against the background of other international organizations and international cooperation in general among the sovereign states. And in this context, I would say that when the problem hits the fan, NATO is still your best bet.
That's right. That's right.
Okay, thank you very, very much. Coffee is served.